Meanwhile, Howard Gombert was keeping busy. From the time of his alleged attack on Tammy A. till his arrest in Connecticut in 2000, Gombert was a crime wave in 2 states. 3 women would later testify that the self-proclaimed warlock, he wore pentagram pendants, threatened to hex women, and had a car decal reading 100% evil, raped and beat them on a regular basis. There was Rachel R., now a mom at 16, who said she'd been raped by Gombert while pregnant. There was her mom, Sheila, a depressed single parent supporting a family on her laundry worker earnings. Before long, she would testify, he was restraining her with zip ties and rope. He'd tie me to the bedpost, Sheila said in depositions. According to Rachel and Sheila, Gombert, the avid woodsman, used complex knots that tightened when they resisted. He punched or choked them in the act. His eyes would turn pitch black in fissile rage. Then there was Anne-Marie D., who was 16 when Gombert wooed her. She said the rapes and beatings commenced forthwith. He would pretty much just hold me down and force me to do it. He has sodomized me, Anne-Marie told an investigator. That went on for years and got increasingly brutal. She finally had him arrested in 1995. Anne-Marie, who has left the state, could not be reached. It was his second arrest for rape in 4 years in Putnam. Both victims were minors when the alleged rapes began. But 9 months later, when Josette's body turned up, Castaldo and Quick never brought in Gombert to ask him about her death. The information we got, Gombert was not in the picture, Castaldo claimed, though there's nothing in the case file to support that. No alibi for Gombert. No statements to suggest he was home when Josette vanished. No eyewitness accounts that place him out of town on the night in question. He's just a hole the size of a Mack truck in this case. The murder of Josette Wright was front-page news, a cause of alarm among county parents. A second girl, Robin Murphy, had vanished in the spring of 1995 and was presumed dead. The pressure on PCS was immense. At least 7 detectives were assigned to Josette's case. 2 of them, Anthony Nappy and Ronald Watkins, turned up lead after lead that pointed to Gombert. When they told Josette's mom that her child had been found dead that morning, the first words out of her mouth, per the 2 cops' notes, Howard Gombert killed her daughter. Watkins and another investigator also talked to Sheila R., who'd left town with Rachel to flee Gombert. She told them about the red and black coupe Gombert drove, which matched the description of the one Josette was seen getting into. Anne-Marie told cops that Gombert admitted to giving Josette a ride on or about the day she disappeared. Those leads, and a great deal more, were given to Castaldo by Nappy, Watkins, and others. They saw Gombert as a suspect in the case and thought Castaldo, the lead detective, would follow up. Instead, he ignored every fact that pointed to Gombert. Here's the master irony of DePippo's story. Had he not been framed for murder, he'd most likely be dead by now. He was a kid on a hot-foot run to hell, angry and rootless and pulling madman stunts that got the cops' attention. He had brains and talent, but didn't know that yet. Only prison and the gift of purpose he got from being wrongly done freed up the time and space to evolve, to become the best version of himself. Now, at 45, he has earned the nobility of someone who saved his own life. Like a lot of Carmel kids, DePippo's youth was undermined by a parent's selfish behavior. He was 8 when his construction worker father took up with the receptionist at his job site. Anthony and his mother, Molly, bounced around the area for the next year, on and off welfare and food stamps. DePippo got fat, trying to eat his way through it. Bullies called him DePippo the Hippo. Then in 6th grade, he shot up half a foot and got very good at backyard wrestling. But shame and rage had twisted a screw in him, made him a too-tall bruiser with a grudge. By high school, he was the kid tossing trash cans into the path of oncoming trains. Likewise his best friend, Andy Krivak. His mother walked out on him when he was young. The house she left behind stunk of mold and pet waste. You'd have that smell on your clothes for days, says DePippo. Krivak was shunted off to alternative schools for kids with behavior disorders. In bad cop lingo, the boys were soft targets, kids who'd cut no ice with jurors. They knew us, and they hated us, says DePippo, who fled Putnam for good after acquittal. To them, we polluted everything but the lake. The boys were arrested on July 1, 1996, and charged with the rape and murder of Josette Wright. The story the prosecution landed on was this. On the evening of October 3, 1994, DePippo and Krivak rang Rose's doorbell and persuaded her to hang with them. Josette was in Krivak's van already, sitting on the floor because the rear seats had been removed. The four kids drove to the Citgo station in town where, according to Rose, there were 20 teens partying in the lot. Over the next 2 hours, they drank beer and got high in full view of passing cops and drivers. Then at 9:30 p.m., Rose asked to go home. She got back in the van with Josette and the boys. They were joined by 2 guys who needed a lift. Instead of taking her home, though, Krivak parked on Fields Lane, a dirt road cut through with no houses or street lamps. Krivak passed around a 40 and a dusted blunt, then suddenly leapt at Josette. He yanked her jeans and underwear over her shoes and stuffed the blue panties in her mouth. Seizing a rope that appeared from nowhere, he tied her hands and raped her while Josette fought back. After Krivak finished, DePippo took his place. In total, the double rape took several minutes, and Josette wasn't breathing when it ended. Again, each of these facts was furnished by Rose, after Castaldo and Quick pressured her for weeks. Her story, which Rose has sworn to 5 times at 4 different trials and a deposition, was absurd on its face. Krivak's van was an ashtray on wheels, an old Econoline with busted dome lights and burn holes. It hadn't been washed, let alone detailed, in ages when the cops pulled it apart. They combed every inch for fibers or fluids, but could find no trace of Josette's blood, hair, or skin cells in the seats or carpet. There were other flaws in this part of Rose's story. The van had 4 seats, not 2, when cops seized it, and it had been off the road with 4 flat tires through the fall and winter of 1994. A mechanic corroborated those details at trial. But it's the next part of the narrative that really jumps the rails. Rose has claimed that she stayed in the van while the boys dragged the corpse to its resting place. She further claimed that there was a full moon out the night of October 3, 1994. That was how the boys were able to navigate woods that are treacherous and foreboding in daylight. When I walked those woods, they were impassable. There are thorns and nettles every step of the way, a creek that suddenly opens under your feet, and old stone barriers built to divert the flow of water to the road. Somehow, says Rose, the boys hiked hundreds of yards through that before laying Josette down. They covered her corpse with leaves and twigs, then made their way back to the van in 10 to 15 minutes, she said during the 2016 trial. It's hard to imagine a woodsman who could replicate that feat, particularly one high on PCP. Then there's the final nail in Rose's story. There was no moon, none, on the night of October 3rd, one expert would testify in court. It rose and fell in a 20-minute span just before dawn the next morning. DePippo and Krivak were either blessed with bat vision, or the whole thing never happened. But when asked about the striking errors in her story, Rose, through her lawyer, declined to comment. Rose's statement would have sufficed to charge the 2 boys, but Castaldo and Quick were just warming up. They dragged in other friends of DePippo and Krivak and coerced them into giving false statements. First, they picked up Adam Wilson. Per Wilson, Castaldo and Quick fed him 3 statements, then told him to pick one and sign it. Likewise, a guy named Bill McGregor, whom they browbeat and menaced for many hours, according to his 2016 testimony, before he agreed to say he was in the van, asleep. They flipped DePippo's ex, an addict named Lisa Murphy, whom they confronted in her jail cell in a neighboring county. According to Murphy, she drove to the Citgo station with her new flame, Michael Sepp. There, she claims, she bumped into Rose and got high with her. This was an easy lie to disprove. Murphy was living with DePippo that fall as his full-time girlfriend, and they were staying at his family's camper in Danbury, Connecticut, on the night in question. Neighbors at the trailer park confirmed that fact. But their statement never got to DePippo's lawyer. A separate piece could be written about the evidence the cops ignored. But for the purposes of this story, one fact will do. Weeks after Josette's body was found, Castaldo and Quick talked to a guy named Charlie Clarkson, the counter clerk at the Citgo station the night Josette went missing. Castaldo and Quick showed him Josette's picture and asked if she'd been with the group of kids gathered outside the store. Clarkson said he'd never seen her before, and that no group of kids that size had gathered there. According to Clarkson, Quick took notes of that conversation, but those notes were never passed to the boys' lawyers. DePippo only learned of them 7 years later, when an investigator he hired tracked Clarkson to Pennsylvania and took his affidavit. But false and missing statements weren't enough for those two cops. They had to do something with the pair of witnesses who saw Josette alive after her supposed death day. Both her sixth-grade teacher and a summer school friend bumped into her at local malls. They were sure about the dates. It was Columbus Day weekend. They told this to Castaldo within days of her disappearance and signed sworn statements in 1994. A year or so later, he had to track them down and convince them to change their stories. Castaldo tricked the summer school friend with a stub from an eyeglass store. Dated September 30th, 1994. She'd gone there to get fitted for contact lenses, so that was when she'd seen Josette, Castaldo told her. He skipped over her second visit on October 7th, the day she actually saw Josette, 4 days after her supposed death day. He pulled a similar stunt with a sixth-grade teacher. He and Quick pressed her again and again. Her statement didn't sync up with their timeline. Finally, she agreed to say that she'd encountered Josette during the Jewish holiday in September. Both women testified at the boys' trials in 1997 that they hadn't seen Josette after October 3rd. But 20 years later, they each came forward to stand by their original statements. They weren't the only witnesses to recant. Bill McGregor, Dominic Neglia, and Adam Wilson took the stand at DePippo's retrial in 2016. Each of them testified that Castaldo and Quick, neither of whom responded to requests for comment through their lawyer, bullied them into bearing false witness.